Okay. Chapter 6 is going to be over photosynthesis. So we're all probably somewhat familiar with photosynthesis, that process that plants do, right? So one of the things you'll want to make sure that you know is the equation for photosynthesis. Okay, so what are the reactants? What do we need for photosynthesis to happen? And then in the end of the whole process, what do we get out of it? So we start with energy from the sun, right? We talked about in the last chapter, the ultimate source of all energy on Earth is the sun. We have some carbon dioxide and some water. So our reactants here, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. And then through this process of photosynthesis, which we'll look at in more depth, we'll end up with glucose, this sugar, and then oxygen. Okay, so this is our equation down here. And you're going to want to make sure that you know that. So here we show this pretty much the same thing, but in a slightly different format. So we see our carbon dioxide and water, add our sunlight, and we get our light-dependent reactions. So we actually split photosynthesis into two separate parts into how these reactions are occurring. Then we have our light-independent reactions, and then we end up with our glucose and our oxygen. All right, so this image shows this whole process here, and we'll look at this exact same image at the end and kind of go through it as we talk about our light-dependent reactions, light-independent, and then all of the different players within this process. Okay, so let's look at the photo step. So this is also known as the light-dependent reactions. This is going to happen within the leaves of a plant, that green part. And we have these specific chloroplasts. These are the organelles within the cells where photosynthesis is happening. And then specifically within these chloroplasts, we've got these darker green disc-shaped structures that are stacked on one another. And this is where our light-dependent reactions are happening within these thylakoids. Okay, so our pigment chlorophyll are within the thylakoids. This is where light-dependent reactions happen. Outside of those thylakoids, all of this other area within the chloroplast is the stroma, and that's where we're going to see the light-independent reactions. Okay, a couple other things that this slide's going to talk about here. We've got the stoma. These are openings in the bottoms of leaves for gas exchange. So they're going to pull carbon dioxide in for photosynthesis, and then they're going to get rid of that oxygen that is produced. Then we've got veins in leaves that are going to pull up various nutrients and then also the water that we need for photosynthesis. All right, so light energy travels in waves, and different wavelengths of light have different energies to them. So we've got our short wavelengths, very energetic, long wavelengths, low energy. So we see that plants capture visible light, just this little part of the electromagnetic spectrum here. And so we've got visible light. These are the colors that we actually see. Okay, so we're going to look at how this occurs. Then we're also going to look at which of these colors photosynthesis works the best with. And so here we see with these photosynthetic bacteria, and it's showing us this visible spectrum and where we're getting the best absorption. So we see that by far, more than anything else, in this blue-purple range, this blue and violet, is where this photosynthesis is working the best. Red, we're seeing quite a bit here as well. But then we see in this green, there's almost nothing. So not a lot of photosynthesis taking place here in the green. But here we've got the blue and the red, the best colors for photosynthesis. And so we can look at the pigments that we see in photosynthetic organisms. And this gives us an idea of why we see these various colors working. So this range here is our blue and our violet. And this range down here is our red. And so we see with our chlorophyll molecules, they absorb a lot of blue and a lot of red. Beta carotene, also quite a bit in the blue and violet. Chlorophyll A over here again in that violet range. Chlorophyll B over here in the red range. So here we see this green range in here. We've got this pigment here, this physerythrobilin, but that's not a very common pigment in a lot of plants, so it doesn't get used very often. Our main pigments that we're going to see used are these chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B molecules. So looking at what actually happens within this photostat. So right now we're within a thylakoid, within the chloroplast. Okay, so we've got our chlorophyll A and our chlorophyll B taking in those violets, blues, and reds. And because of the color of these pigments, they're reflecting these green and yellow-green colors. And that's why leaves look green, because these pigments reflect those colors. Now, there are other pigments that are part of this process. Okay, so we've got our carotenoids, which will absorb some blue and green and reflect orange. Okay. So when we look at this process, we see that the main pigments here are these green chlorophyll A and chlorophyll Bs, so they reflect that green light. And so as we see here in this image, chlorophyll B, chlorophyll A dominate most of the spring and summer and fall, early fall anyway. But as we get toward later fall, closer to winter, these chlorophyll pigments start to break down within the leaves of these deciduous trees. And so as these chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B become less common within the leaf, we start to see more and more of these carotenoids. And that's why leaves change their colors in the fall, is because of the breakdown of these pigments. And then those carotenoids are going to start reflecting those reds and those yellows. So our light-dependent reactions, they take place within the thylakoid. We're taking in sunlight and we're taking in water, and we're producing our ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Okay? So when we're looking at these individual two steps, our light-dependent and our light-independent reactions, we're going to look at where each of these happens, what goes in and what comes out. So for our light-dependent reactions, you need to remember that we use sunlight and water. And in this process, we produce some NADPH, right? This was one of those electron carriers we talked about in chapter 5. And then ATP, this energy molecule. Then this is where we're getting that oxygen, which leaves the plant so that organisms like us can breathe. We will talk about hydrogen ions here, or protons, that are part of this process. So just so you know, hydrogen ions are just referred to protons, because if you look here, if you take away this electron, it's just a proton that's left. All right, so making ATP. So essentially what we see here is that light energy from the sun comes and it hits this chlorophyll molecule, typically in that blue or red wavelength. What that does is it excites one of these electrons. Okay, that excited electron then transfers to a nearby chlorophyll, shooting off another electron, which moves to the next one, and we continue this process. Eventually, this electron being taken up by this primary electron acceptor, and that will then be sent to the electron transport chain, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But now we've got these chlorophylls, or one of these chlorophylls, that is short an electron. And so this is where the water comes in. We strip apart these water molecules, getting our protons or hydrogen ions, and refilling that electron in that chlorophyll molecule. And then the oxygen is just left over from those water molecules, and it will then be released. Okay? So why do plants need water? Plants need that water for the electrons and the protons for the electron transport chain and those chlorophyll molecules. Okay? So we'll pick up here talking about the rest of photosynthesis in just a bit.